Welcome back to our program, How to End Destructive Habits. And this is part one, step one of our three-step program. And in this first step, we're going to discuss the anatomy of a habit or addiction. And this is really just so fundamental to understand what a habit or addiction is. And I want to preface my comments by explaining that there are so many different ideas out there, so many different programs, so many books have been written, so many authorities of one kind or another who've had viewpoints on this whole issue of destructive habits and addictions. I want to, in this program, my goal is to help you to end the habit. As we're going to see, a lot of times addictions and destructive, unhealthy habits, they're seen in the context of people's past history, in terms of the possibility that people are dealing with certain emotional challenges or some kind of medical or mental disorders of one type or another. And in many different instances, programs are developed that really kind of put an emphasis on the kind of deep underlying causes of unhealthy habits. And there is a place for that. There is certainly some value to that. But if we want to really focus on how to end a destructive habit, which is the goal of this program, then we really have to understand what a habit is, what an addiction is. And so I want to be able to share with you that what I've put together through this program is based on a tremendous amount of scientific research. Now, the research is typically done around a specific problem, whether it's drug abuse or alcohol addiction, obsessive compulsive disorder, bulimia and binge eating disorders, pornography and sexual addiction. In other words, research often focuses on a particular kind of destructive habit or addiction. But what's interesting is that when we look at the anatomy of a habit, the scientific research is pointing to a common causality. In other words, whatever form the habit may take, a habit to this substance or an addiction to a certain thought process or whatever it is, whatever form it takes, whatever way it expresses itself externally, the research is more and more pointing to a common causality, a common factor that is behind addictions and unhealthy habits. So what we want to do here is kind of focus on what it is that creates a habit, and a habit that you don't want. What creates it? And then what can you do in order to overcome that habit? And irrespective, again, of the form or external expression of whatever it is you're dealing with, one person smoking, another person overeating, whatever, we want to look like in an iceberg at the underlying cause of what makes habits habits. Well, actually, if you think about your own experience, acting on a habit, whether it's a behavioral habit, such as, let's say, binge eating, or some psychological habit like repetitive thinking, like in obsessive compulsive disorder, whatever the habit, whatever the form it takes, without an urge to act on that habit, there's no habit. These urges and cravings, they can be very powerful. In fact, certainly, I know many of you feel that perhaps they're overwhelming. That as you get an urge to act on the habit, and then it kind of takes you over. It overwhelms you. Well, because these urges, these cravings, they're feelings experienced in the body physically. And we can easily have an additional feeling on top of the urge, that the urge or craving is more powerful than our will, and therefore we have to act on that. And from the conventional model of habits and addictions, the kind of more traditional view of how to change behavior or thoughts or feelings, we have to put our focus on the outside circumstances or the deep psychological issues that are thought to have to be resolved before there can be success in removing a habit, and before removing the habit or addiction can occur. And sometimes it's suggested that people are suffering because of a lack of willpower, because of some kind of mental or psychological disorder. And once again, I want to be able to try to get that so that you can read the very bottom, that it's necessary in order to be able to overcome habits, to track the triggers that are said to trigger it, or divert attention, or develop coping skills. And there's a place for this, and there's certainly a place for, at some point, looking at the deep psychological reasons why you might have formed the habit. But to actually break the habit, what we need to do is understand that without an urge, without a craving, there is no habit. Now, I did a review course for continuing medical education for my medical license. And in the review materials, which is the latest in the research around addiction, they were dealing particularly with alcohol addiction. They said something very telling here, this quote: "The bulk of preclinical and clinical evidence indicates that patients with substance use disorders do not use substances of abuse to self-medicate underlying psychiatric illnesses." What they said is that evidence demonstrates that exposure to addictive substances causes changes in deep brain structures that in turn prompt continued use and ultimately addiction. This is the key, that there are changes in deep brain structures. What this means is that if we can understand what is happening in the brain, deep within the brain, and the good news is that we absolutely can, and we are going to be able to learn a tremendous amount about this, and not just learn intellectually, but be able to put it into practice and implement it in a way that's going to make a very real difference for you. But it's the idea that, yes, there may have been psychological issues or even psychological disorders that might have played a role in the development of the habit and even in the continuation of the habit, but the primary thing is what's happening within deep brain structures. So what we want to do initially is we want to put the focus on the urge or the craving, be able to deal with that, and break the conceptual link, the kind of thought process that suggests that you would need to solve the other problematic issues in your life before you'd be able to end the habit. Again, this is sort of buying into the idea that your habit is a way of coping and feeling better emotionally, and unless you deal with your life circumstances, find better ways of coping, better ways to feel emotionally, according to that viewpoint, you won't be able to really overcome the habit. But actually what we're finding is that other problematic issues that you're dealing with, other than the habit, can certainly be addressed and dealt with, but you can address that after your habit is ended and is behind you. When you're free of the habit, free of the addiction, then you're able to pursue personal growth and whatever you feel would be in your best interest. And in consultation with health professionals or with mental health professionals, you can find resources and things that you could be involved with that could help you improve your life situation, improve your health. But we want to be able to focus right now through this program on ending the habit. Then you can deal with these other things afterwards. So if it's not about coping with uncomfortable feelings or problems, what is then the direct cause of addictions? Okay, so he said it's about the urge to think in a certain way, the urge to act in a certain way, the urge to go to the refrigerator and overeat, the urge to drink alcohol when you know that it's not something that you want to do, that it's not something that's in your best interest. Whatever, again, it bears repeating that whatever form the habit takes, whatever way it's expressed externally, it's always about the urge. Without the urge, there's no habit. So what we want to do then is focus on the urge, but not fighting the urge. That's willpower and white knuckling it, and that's very, very difficult and very exhausting. So we don't want to fight the urge, and we certainly don't want to give in to the urge, but there's the third option for us, the third alternative, which is to gain insight about the urge, which itself, the insight will be the key to ending the habit. As we know, when we know the truth will set us free. So without an urge or a craving, there's no habit. And we can't make the urges go away. And we can try to fight them, we could give in. We can't really make them go away, but we can see them and experience them in a new way so that we stop acting on them. And then the good news, they will go away on their own. So let's begin to look a little bit more about this latest leading edge brain science and what it's telling us as it relates to the formation of habits and addictions and the role of urges and cravings. The latest brain science is providing incredible insight as to how habits are formed and maintained and how they can be ended. The understanding of the preeminent role of urges in strengthening and maintaining habitual thinking and behavior. And what we want to do is we want to experience the urge in a new way, which essentially renders them powerless. This is the key, to be able to see urges in a new way and experience them in a new way. So originally, at the very beginning, you probably did whatever you were doing out of just a desire to feel better, to kind of improve your mood, to feel better, to deal with stress, whatever. It's kind of an innocent effort to simply feel better. That was the origin of your habit, that we were not comfortable in some way, and we might have had thoughts and feelings we didn't want to have to face. And so the initial activity, which later became a habit, is really just a kind of innocent way of trying to feel better in the moment, even though by repeating that particular activity, whether it's a thought activity or a behavioral, physical activity, it later is going to create its own very serious challenges for us when it becomes deeply seated as an addiction. The consequence of this repetition of the behavior over a period of time leads us to have stronger and stronger feelings that we need to repeat the unhealthy or destructive action. Here, now we recognize that we're in some kind of a difficulty. We don't want to do something that's really going to hurt us, that's going to be destructive, that's going to be unhealthy. But now we've got, through repetition, stronger and stronger urges to behave in a certain way. And we reach a point where we act on those urges simply to make them go away. In other words, it's no longer a matter of trying to feel better. It's a matter of acting on the urge so that the pressure can go off, that we don't have to feel the tension that builds with having an urge and not acting on it. So we act, but only to make the urge go away. And what is happening through this process, because of the repetition, is that a part of our brain picks up that psychological experience and forms physical connections, what are called neural circuits, nerve connections in the brain, which become strongly reinforced because the activity, which now is forming a habit, is associated with pleasurable sensations and the release of feel-good neurochemicals like serotonin and dopamine. So our habit becomes reinforced. And rather than finding any comfort, as was our original objective, we are now severely burdened and made miserable by the habit, by the very thing that initially was there to kind of have us feel better. And associated with this urge, it can be a deep feeling, it can be even a kind of voice telling us that and that voice, it comes from within our own consciousness. So in a way, we can easily identify with it and think it's kind of a part of us, telling us to act on our habit as all kinds of very elaborate and sophisticated rationalizations. And while it can sound to us in our consciousness as if it's our own voice or our own kind of mental dialogue, it's not really us at all. It's really just temporary faulty brain messages that are being reinforced through the repetition of the habit. Now, the more that we identify those urges as being truly us, that it's like a part of us is saying, yeah, you want to do this. This is okay. And you can always end the habit another time. For now, you've been working hard. You need a break, or whatever kind of rationalization or justification is there. We can sense it as somehow a part of us. We therefore then start telling ourselves all kinds of things about how we feel about ourselves and feeling shame or guilt over it. We start having thoughts about the meaning of it all and whether or not we'll ever be able to overcome our habit. And the more mental and psychological attention that we place on the issue, the more power we give to that voice, the more power we give to that voice, the stronger that voice becomes. So as I said before, we cannot really make that voice go away. We can't really make the urge go away, but we can experience it in a different way, so we stop acting on it, and then it goes away on its own. Now here's a very important author in this field, Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz, psychiatrist, research professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine. And here he says, seeing things as they really are, or literally in accordance with the truth, quickly recognizing the disturbing thoughts as senseless, as false, as errant brain signals, not even worth the gray matter they wrote in on, let alone worth acting on. What Dr. Schwartz is saying is that the more we understand the truth of that addictive voice, that sense within our own consciousness that we really do need to act on our habit, even though we don't want to, and it's really unhealthy and destructive for us. The more we see that kind of voice, that kind of feeling is really just toxic waste from the brain. it has no truth associated with it. It's just a kind of, as he said, these are errant brain signals, not even worth the gray matter they wrote in on, let alone work acting on. It's a matter of seeing them as toxic waste from the brain. And the more we can do that, the less power they have. So to develop this a little further, the brain science is demonstrating now that we have what we could call, of course, the brain is an amazingly complex organ. And the good news is we don't necessarily have to understand that much about it in order to be able to really have the practical understanding that will allow us to be able to end our habits. But there is a kind of what we call the higher brain. The higher brain is over there on the left of the slide. This is the higher consciousness. This is where the conscience resides. This is where the centers for judgment, for altruism, for being unselfish, for loving, all of these higher brain centers are located in the higher brain, or prefrontal cortex is more technical. At the same time, we have the lower brain. Actually, the lower brain is over on the left of the slide, yeah. And on the right side is the higher brain. That's the prefrontal cortex. On the left of your slide is the lower brain. This is below the higher brain, below the prefrontal cortex, and it's made up of structures like the limbic system, the amygdala, again, a little bit technical. And the more we can understand how this lower brain, the limbic system, amygdala, brainstem, controls the formation of habits, the more insight we have, the more power we'll have to be able to deal with this effectively and end our habit. So the lower brain controls the most basic functions for survival. And while it generates urges and commands for food, water, shelter, sexual activity for procreation, while it generates all of these basic functions for survival, it has no direct control over our behavior. The upper brain, on the other hand, the prefrontal cortex, another structure there called the anterior cingulate cortex, this is the area which makes choices based on conscience, based on judgment, making decisions. It causes behavior, generates compassion. So the upper brain is much more identified with who we really are as a person. The lower brain is kind of more like they say a kind of like an animal brain. All the lower forms of animal life in the evolutionary process, the lower brain associated with reptiles and with just the very most basic animal instincts. But the human being, the spiritual reality of our existence, this comes to our awareness through the functions of the upper brain. So by understanding the lower brain and the upper brain, we get a handle then on how urges are created and what we can do to effectively deal with them. Unhealthy habits, as they become more and more reinforced, because they really are acting against what you believe conscientiously is in your best interest. So they become associated with guilt and fear, frustration and anger. This ignites the stress response called the fight or flight response, which actually is a very healthy thing. The fight or flight response, if we're facing a real danger, driving down the interstate and a car swerves in our path, and the stress response kicks in order to be able to have us effectively manage the situation safely and avoid any collision. But as a result of habits and addictions and associated guilt and fear and anger, frustration, we have a chronic ongoing activation of the stress response. And this causes the ongoing release of stress hormones. These damage the higher brain's anterior cingulate cortex. And as a result of disrupted higher brain judgment and decision-making capabilities, all of this becomes recognized by the lower brain as kind of necessary for survival because of the repetition, because of the patterns that are established through the repetition. The lower brain, and associated also not only with the guilt and the fear, but also with pleasurable sensations as well. The lower brain mistakenly interprets the urge and the resulting habit as something necessary for survival. But the lower brain, again, it's not a real thinking kind of, while it can convey its messages through what might be considered almost a kind of voice, that lower brain actually has no control over our bodily movements. It's like just an automatic machine, kind of like an alarm clock that you set, and then at a certain time the alarm goes off. The alarm goes off, it might jolt you to awaken you, but it can't actually cause you to get out of bed. As much as it might be an obnoxious ring that wakes you up and maybe you're having trouble turning it off, but it's still in and of itself, the alarm clock and the alarm sound can't make you actually do anything. But it certainly kind of propels you in a certain direction. And that's what happens with our lower brain as a result of these patterned conditional neurocircuits. We then have urges being generated, cravings being generated. And while they can feel very, very strong and powerful and very aggressive and pushing us to do something we don't want to do, in reality, it's just a machine. It's just a kind of machine that's generating these messages, generating these signals, but has no real power to cause any definitive action. Our upper brain, however, the higher brain, is our connection to God through our conscientious nature and our capacity for unselfish love, all the things that make us really a human being, wisdom, the capacity for higher levels of judgment and common sense. That's what's really in charge. That's who you really are. That's the part of your brain that's associated with who you really are as a human being, as a spiritual child of God. And while the lower brain cannot control action, it's you through your higher brain that's actually in charge. Although because of the power of the craving, the power of the urge, it may not feel that way. So again, it may feel a certain way, but in reality, it does not have the power that you feel that it has. Once again, Dr. Schwartz said that there were, quote, two competing systems of brain circuitry. One coming from the lower brain, faulty brain messages. In his case, he was researching folks with obsessive compulsive disorder. And the other, the prefrontal cortex, which is the higher brain, which remain capable of overcoming the faulty brain messages. So what he's saying through his research, it's two competing systems of brain circuitry. And even though the lower brain is sending these toxic messages, they can feel very powerful. In fact, it's the prefrontal cortex, the higher brain, that really has the power and the capability of overcoming these faulty, toxic brain messages. And the good news is that even though there's, as I said, some kind of destructive impact from the chronic stress response in terms of damaging the higher brain centers and hyperactivating the lower brain circuitry. The good news is that the research is telling us that these changes in the brain and the brain structures and the conditioning of the lower brain do not create permanent changes in the brain cells or the brain connections. In other words, even though there's damage, it's not necessarily permanent damage. And this is a concept known as neuroplasticity. When I went to medical school, they taught us that the brain is kind of like a static organ. You lose brain cells, you lose connections in the brain, that's it. They can't be restored. Unlike other parts of the body that they recognize, they're able to regenerate. They said the brain just can't. Well, that's not true. We now know that the brain is very fluid. The term used is neuroplasticity. And these changes in neural pathways and connections, the synapses or connections, which are due to changes in behavior, environment, and various processes. And the most important of these factors that will change the neural pathways or our belief systems, our thoughts, our feelings, our beliefs. So neuroplasticity has replaced the concept that the brain is a static organ. Now here we can see some brain scans of a normal brain over on the left, and then in the middle, the brain on heroin, over on the right, the brain on porn. But again, with what I'm going to share with you through this program, the brain circuitry can rewire, can heal, can reestablish itself, and we can regain health. Of course, the sooner we do this, the better. It's never too late, but the sooner we do it, the better off we are. Now, this neuroplasticity is such an important concept because we're talking about changing brain circuitry, rewiring, healing the brain. So each time we let stress reactions come and go without acting on them, the destructive neurological circuits diminish and healthy circuits are strengthened. This is Dr. Schwartz again, quote, "By focusing attention away from negative behaviors and towards positive ones, patients were able to make permanent changes to their own neural pathways." This is exactly what we want to understand how to accomplish. Further quote from Dr. Schwartz, "The brain's ensembles of neurons, meaning nerve cells over time, forming new connections that become stronger with use, and letting unused synapses weaken." This means the toxic messages from the lower brain, as we learn how to see our urges in a new way, those unused synapses of the lower brain weaken until they are able to carry signals no better than a frayed string between two tin cans in the old game of telephone. Isn't that wonderful? These neurons over time make new connections, and the ones that are not used, they fade and recede until they're no longer able to carry signals no better than a frayed string between two tin cans in the old game of telephone. We therefore have an understanding that based on how we were created by God, how the brain is formed in order to be able to, through the lower brain, have us survive and have basic physiological function and to survive, and the higher brain to be able to bring in the higher centers of love and compassion, good judgment, conscientiousness, that the more we can understand how to utilize the power of the brain in a way that we want, how to use our mind the way that God intended us to use our mind and our brain, we can decrease the destructive brain circuitry. We can learn how to let go and dismiss neurological garbage, calm the limbic and amygdala circuits of the lower brain activated by the flight or fight response. And at the same time that we're decreasing destructive brain circuitry, we're increasing the healthy brain circuitry of the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex. We're increasing the healthy brain circuitry, connecting with God's love and wisdom, and strengthening these higher centers of the higher brain. So with that, in the way of step one, it was a context for what's to follow in step two and step three. We now understand that there's no habit without there being an urge. And urges are feelings that become stronger based on the repetition of an action that the lower brain is just considering to be necessary for survival, particularly as it's reinforced and more powerfully conditioned in the neural circuitry. But we can also understand that by seeing and experiencing these urges in a new way, then we can actually learn to dismiss them. So we don't act on the urge. And the more we don't act on the urge, the weaker those circuitries in the lower brain become. And we can see and experience the urge in a new way so that they go away on their own. Okay, well, that's step one. Please review the PowerPoint, the workbook, the worksheets. You can listen to this video as many times as you want. Repetition is so important. In this case, repetition is important because we are really expressing the truth of the way things work. And you want repetition of the truth. Okay, well, you have a very good day and looking forward to seeing you in step two.